Hello, I'm Herman Eberhardt, Supervisory Museum Curator here at the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, back again to explore interesting items from the museum collection. If you've watched some of our other video programs, you know that our museum collection is an extremely diverse one, covering all types of objects. Some of the most intriguing things are found in the special collections that FDR himself personally gathered and collected. FDR was a born collector, and he spent a lifetime amassing several large and important personal collections. He searched out and acquired coins, rare books, art and artifacts connected to the history and culture of his native Hudson River Valley, and a vast collection of items related to naval and maritime history. But the largest and most intense of FDR's collecting interests was his lifelong passion for stamp collecting. During the course of his life, he assembled an enormous collection of over 1 million stamps. His keen interest in stamp collecting became widely known during his presidency, and he's credited with expanding the popularity of this hobby. In this program, we will delve into Mr. Roosevelt's interest in stamps, examine stamps and stamp-related objects from our collection, get a better understanding of why FDR was so devoted to stamp collecting, and see how this hobby actually helped him during his presidency. FDR began collecting stamps at the age of 8 at the suggestion of his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who passed on her own stamp collection to him. And he was still collecting at the time of his death at age 63. FDR enjoyed stamps, he said, not for their intrinsic value, but because of their links to history and geography. Stamp collecting was also a hobby that gave him solace after he was stricken with polio in 1921 and permanently paralyzed below the waist. During his long, difficult years of physical therapy and coming to terms with his disability in the 1920s, he spent many bedridden hours arranging and annotating thousands of stamp specimens. He later said of this period in his life, "I owe my life to my hobbies, especially stamp collecting." Later, during his years as America's president, this hobby provided a way for him to relax at the end of a busy and stressful day, and set aside, if only for a short while, the burdens of his complex job. He even brought parts of his stamp collection with him on extended trips that he took around the United States and abroad. During these journeys, he could unwind during downtimes by working with his stamps. FDR's interest in stamp collecting was without a doubt the best known of his many collecting interests. Stamp enthusiasts were well aware of his involvement in their hobby even before he became president. In fact, during his first presidential campaign in 1932, the American Philatelic Society, the country's premier organization for stamp hobbyists, endorsed him. The group even promoted his candidacy by printing, appropriately enough, special promotional stamps. They were available in different colors like these and featured FDR's portrait and the group's stamp of approval for a stamp collector for president. After FDR was elected president, his passion for stamp collecting became widely known to the general public. The president was known to spend time every day with his collection, often in the evening after the day's business had ended. He described the pleasure he gained from his hobby in a 1937 letter to the Philatelic Society, quote, "The best thing about stamp collecting as a pursuit is that the enthusiasm which it arouses in youth increases as the years pass. It dispels boredom, enlarges our vision, broadens our knowledge of geography, and in innumerable ways enriches life and adds to its joys," end quote. Now, I mentioned earlier that FDR's stamp collection ultimately numbered over 1 million stamps. As curator here, I sometimes get questions from the public inquiring about this enormous collection. I have to tell people that there are actually relatively few stamps from FDR's collection here at the Roosevelt Library. That's because in his will, President Roosevelt directed that the collection be auctioned off after his death to benefit his heirs. Nearly the entire collection went on the auction block in 1946. It was appraised at $80,000, that's about $1.4 million in today's money, and was divided into small lots so that even people of modest means could purchase a piece of the president's collection. At auction, the collection sold for a great deal more than the appraised value. The final tally was $228,000. That would be nearly $4 million in current dollars. Here's a certificate for one of the lots sold during the 1946 sale. In the decades since that auction, a number of people have contacted us to donate small lots of stamps that were purchased in 1946 by a family member. Consequently, over the years, the Roosevelt Library has acquired about 1,000 stamps from the sale. We also have an interesting selection of international stamps and stamp albums that FDR received as gifts from foreign governments. Those stamps were not sold at the 1946 auction. Now, while we don't have many stamps from FDR's collection, we do have a number of interesting items connected to his stamp collecting hobby that I want to share with you. Let's begin with stamp collecting tools. There are certain basic tools that stamp collectors use to examine, measure, and test stamps. And here we've assembled some of the actual tools that FDR used when working with his stamps. Because the president used these tools regularly, he would keep them nearby at all times, including when he traveled. Let's start with these two magnifying lenses. These were obviously helpful when FDR was examining details in stamp designs and checking out the physical condition of a stamp. This 1937 flasholens magnifier came with a battery-operated light that the president could use to aid him as he examined tiny details. Next, we have this 1937 model rotogauge perforation gauge. Now, what exactly was this for? Well, stamp collectors use gauges like this one to measure the number of perforation holes in a 2-centimeter length of a stamp. And why do they do that? Well, some stamps are printed at different times with different numbers of perforation holes. Consequently, seemingly identical stamps can be valued very differently because stamps from certain printings are scarcer than others. So identifying the number of perforation holes on a stamp can help determine its printing date, scarcity, and value. Incidentally, this particular perforation gauge was sent to FDR as a gift by a 15-year-old stamp collector who lived in Illinois. Another basic tool in identifying and classifying stamps is this watermark tray. Stamps were often printed with a watermark to deter counterfeiting. Those watermarks were also helpful in determining a stamp's scarcity and value. To reveal a watermark, FDR would take a stamp and place it face down inside this tray. Then he would drop several drops of a fast-evaporating liquid solvent like benzene on the stamp to reveal the security watermark in the stamp paper. The last item we've assembled here is this rather nondescript wood and brass box. So why is this here? Well, this was FDR's constant companion on long trips he took during his presidency. He would pack this box with stamps and his stamp collecting tools so that he could work on his collection during free time amid his travels. We know that he tried to work with his stamps for at least half an hour each day, so this was a real necessity when he went on the road for an extended period. Now let's turn to another aspect of FDR's stamp collecting. For a passionate, lifelong collector like FDR, one of the great advantages of becoming President of the United States had to be the opportunity to interact directly with the U.S. Postal Service. One perk he enjoyed was receiving first-issue sheets of newly designed stamps like this one. These were presented to him by Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau, Jr., who had jurisdiction over the Postal Service. When Morgenthau brought sheets like this one to the president, he and FDR would each sign the sheet. You can see their signatures on the top there. We have a number of these signed first-issue stamp sheets in the museum collection. Another perk of his job was that FDR was now in a position to work with the U.S. Postal Service on the creation of new postal stamps. And it should come as no surprise that he became deeply involved in the design and issuance of new stamps during his presidency. He and his Postmaster General, James A. Farley, brainstormed over stamp themes, designs, and colors. Ultimately, FDR contributed to the design of more than 200 stamps during his presidency. Some of the stamps FDR approved were connected to his New Deal programs. Here are a few examples. The stamp on the left refers to the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. The NRA was one of the most important early New Deal agencies working to end the Great Depression. The stamp features an image of a farmer, a businessman, a blue-collar worker, and a white-collar worker, all united, as the stamp indicates, in a common determination for the nation's economic recovery. The stamp in the middle celebrates the opening of the massive Boulder Dam on the Colorado River. This was an enormous multi-year infrastructure project completed under the New Deal. This dam was later renamed and is now known as the Hoover Dam. FDR's administration also saw tremendous growth in the nation's system of national parks, and the stamp on the right celebrates one of the many new parks created by the President, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which straddles the states of North Carolina and Tennessee. In some cases, we have direct evidence of FDR's personal role in a stamp's design. That's because he would sometimes give the Postmaster General a hand-drawn sketch of something he wanted. Here is one example. In 1939, the states of Washington, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana were all marking their 50th anniversary as U.S. states. Each wanted their own commemorative postal stamp to mark the anniversary. But FDR suggested something different in this drawing that he sent to the Postmaster General. He even signed and dated the drawing at the bottom. The President thought that since the 4 states were all located near one another, a single stamp depicting all 4 on a map would be more interesting. And here on the right is a die proof for the final version of the stamp. As you can see, it looks a lot like what FDR had sketched. Here's another example of FDR's direct involvement in stamp design. After he reviewed the Postal Service's initial design for a stamp honoring women's rights leader Susan B. Anthony, he sketched this revision, placing Anthony's portrait inside a dark oval frame. His changes were adopted in the final version of the stamp that you see on the right. Note again how FDR proudly signed and dated his proposed design at the bottom of his sketch. In 1934, the famed American explorer Richard Byrd was planning his second expedition to Antarctica, and the Postal Service prepared designs for a stamp honoring him. After rejecting 4 of their proposed designs, FDR sketched this plan for a stamp that featured the routes shown in dotted lines of Byrd's previous global expeditions. When Postmaster General Farley brought the President the revised design, FDR scrutinized it and then pointed out a small mistake in the position of one of the dotted lines. The final version of the stamp, pictured on the right, reflects the President's overall design and his final editorial tweak. In 1934, the Postal Service was planning to issue a stamp honoring the artist James Whistler, best known for his painting of Whistler's mother. But the President had a different idea. He wanted to use the image of Whistler's mother as the centerpiece for a stamp honoring America's mothers on Mother's Day. He sketched out his idea in this drawing, which includes the text, "In memory and in honor of the mothers of America." And here is the final version of the stamp, reflecting FDR's idea. The President directed that this stamp be printed in time for use in the mails during the weeks leading up to Mother's Day in May 1934. This last example of FDR as stamp designer is a significant one because President Roosevelt considered this to be the one stamp that he designed almost completely on his own. In 1938, the Postal Service was planning a nationwide publicity campaign to encourage people to use airmail. The centerpiece was National Airmail Week. On the first day of that week, they planned to issue a brand new airmail stamp. FDR got directly involved in the project and drafted this sketch for the new stamp, complete with color suggestions. As you can see here, the airmail stamp that resulted largely followed his design, though his suggestion that the eagle be blue was not followed, and his idea for a red border for the stamp was eliminated. Now, earlier in this program, I mentioned that FDR's stamp collecting hobby became widely known to Americans during his presidency. Consequently, he received many stamp-related gifts from admirers. We have just a few arranged here on the table. This intricate portrait of the President is made entirely from pieces of nearly 2,500 German postal stamps from the 1920s. Glenn Golton of Wichita, Kansas, painstakingly created this portrait as a birthday gift for FDR in January 1937. Here's another birthday gift to the President. I can only show you part of it because this actually opens up to reveal 68 panels. Together, they make up an enormous birthday greeting card. Each panel features a different design made entirely with postal stamps. This unusual gift was created by a graphic artist named Ernest Chase, who lived in Winchester, Massachusetts. He sent it to the President in 1935 to mark FDR's 53rd birthday. This album of Dutch stamps was sent to the President by a group of school children in the Netherlands. FDR, of course, had a special connection to the Netherlands because of his family's lineage, and he certainly would have treasured this gift. Many stamp enthusiasts sent the President stamp covers like this one. Stamp covers are decorated commemorative envelopes created to celebrate an event or note an anniversary. A design called a cachet generally appears on the left side of the envelope and explains what is being commemorated. The envelopes are stamped at postal facilities on the specific date of the anniversary. This is an example of a stamp cover sent to FDR in 1941. As you can see on the left, the event being commemorated is the anniversary of Armistice Day, the last day of World War I, which ended at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of that year. And as you can see, the envelope has been stamped November 11, 1941 at exactly 11 a.m. Now there is something else that is significant about this particular stamp cover. Note that this envelope was posted in Honolulu, Hawaii on November 11, 1941. And if I turn the envelope over, we can see that the person who mailed it to FDR was a Mr. J.B. Tyndall, who was employed at the Naval Air Station at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Of course, what Mr. Tyndall and FDR couldn't know was that less than a month after he sent this card to the president at the White House, the Naval Air Station at Pearl Harbor would suffer a devastating attack when Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Now, on a much lighter note, we also have a lot of stamp-related correspondence in the President's papers here at the Roosevelt Library. This correspondence includes this wonderful exchange of letters in 1935, which I have to show you. In July 1935, FDR wrote this letter to Bobby Kennedy, the 9-year-old son of Joseph Kennedy, who was serving in the Roosevelt administration as director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Young Bobby Kennedy, of course, would grow up to serve as Attorney General in his brother John F. Kennedy's presidential administration. FDR's letter to Bobby Kennedy reads, "Your dad has told me that you are a stamp collector, and I thought you might like to have these stamps to add to your collection. I am also enclosing a little album which you may find useful. Perhaps sometime when you are in Washington, you will come in and let me show you my collection." 1 week later, 9-year-old Bobby sent FDR this handwritten response. He writes, "Dear Mr. President, I like the stamps you sent me very much, and the little book is very useful. I am just starting my collection, and it would be great fun to see yours, which Mother says you have had for a long time. I am going to frame your letter, and I am going to keep it always in my room." Now next I want to show you what is certainly the most important and prized object we have in our entire collection that relates to FDR's stamp collecting. This item came to us several years ago as a donation from a private individual. This is the very first stamp album in FDR's collection. The label on the front is from the 1946 sale of the Roosevelt collection. It indicates that the album was auctioned off with the rest of FDR's stamps at that time. So this album is where it all began for FDR. He started work on this stamp album as an 8-year-old novice collector, and this became the starting place for a collection that eventually included over 1 million stamps. Here's an inside view of 2 pages from the album. As I mentioned earlier, FDR started collecting stamps at the suggestion of his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. Many individuals on her side of FDR's family, the Delanos, were involved in overseas trade during the 19th century. Consequently, young FDR received a steady supply of foreign stamps, like the ones you see here, from his well-traveled Delano relatives. He then carefully organized and stored them in this album and other albums that he acquired during his early life. So that was a peek at FDR's earliest involvement with stamp collecting. Now, as we wrap up this program, I want to tell you one more story about an artifact that demonstrates his continuing interest in stamps until the very end of his life. During the last year of his life, President Roosevelt was increasingly ill. Suffering from very high blood pressure, made worse by the stress of leading a nation at war, he was slowly dying of heart disease. The end came on the afternoon of April 12, 1945, at Warm Springs, Georgia, where the president died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. It's interesting to note that FDR's last official acts that day have a connection to stamps. At the time of his death, the president was preparing to attend the first United Nations conference, which was scheduled to begin on April 25, 1945, in San Francisco. FDR had been deeply involved in the creation of the United Nations organization, which he hoped would prevent future world wars. The U.S. Postal Service had prepared several designs for a commemorative stamp to celebrate the opening of the UN conference. And on April 9th, the Postmaster General sent a memo to the President asking him to select his preferred design. On April 11th, the day before he died, FDR selected this design. It features an olive branch at the bottom, a symbol for peace and reconciliation, and then there's this short quote, "Toward United Nations," and the date of the upcoming conference. And then on the lower right, in small type, FDR's name. The following day, April 12th, the final day of his life, FDR spent the morning reviewing paperwork and signing documents. And the very last directives he gave that day, the last of his presidency, were to agree to personally purchase the first issue of this new United Nations stamp and to instruct the Secretary of State to present gift albums of the new stamp to all the delegates at the April 25th UN conference. As we look back on the life of Franklin Roosevelt, it seems fitting that his last official acts involved two things that he loved very deeply: the United Nations organization that he had championed, and postal stamps, the great collecting passion of his life. I hope you've enjoyed this program on FDR's stamp collecting hobby. You can learn more about the items featured in this video and other items in the museum collection by checking out the museum's digital artifact collection. It can be found on our website. See you next time.